Hello everyone, welcome to Bilateral Bites. With both the Australia Day and Republic Day around the corner, today we would be revisiting the idea of democracy and what it means to both Australia and India. We have with us Ms. Tanya Spisbah and Mr. Hindol Sengupta. Ms. Spisbah is the director of Australia-India Institute, Delhi. She is a renowned and influential expert on Australia-India relations, particularly with respect to health and sustainable development. A career diplomat with Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for more than a decade, Ms. Spisbah served from 2014 to 2017 at the Australian High Commission, New Delhi, specializing in health, technology, diplomacy for inclusive and sustainable growth. She notably led the health agenda, resulting in the Australian and Indian Prime Ministers exchanging the MOU for health and medicine, paving the way for cooperation on digital health. Other areas of policy leadership include smart cities and infrastructure, governance, and investment. Hindol Sengupta is an award-winning historian and author of 9 books. He has been a Shivnik Scholar at the University of Oxford and a Knight Paget Fellow at Columbia University. He is a columnist for Fortune India, the Indian edition of Fortune magazine. He is an alumnus of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue and Vice President and Head of Research of Invest India, the investment promotion agency of the Government of India. Thank you both for joining us. I think I would want to start this conversation by asking a very pertinent question. What does democracy mean to the idea of India?
So, for me, I'll give my perspective as an Australian living here in India. I think democracy is absolutely a crux of Indian identity, in my personal view. Last year, Australia-India Institute and our counterparts in India had the opportunity to host something called Election Watch. So Election Watch featured Indian past electoral commissioners, the Victorian electoral commissioner from Australia, and many academics and thought leaders, including the Australian High Commissioner, the Honourable Harinder Sidhu. So this was a really wonderful exchange about the importance and vibrancy of democracy in each country. For India in particular, 2019 saw the largest ever participation in democracy at 67% of 908.7 million people enrolled. For an Australian, that's just unfathomable. So I don't think you can describe Indian democracy as anything but vibrant and very well alive. It's honestly one of the greatest and inclusive democracies, with 2019 also seeing Braille rolled out in the electronic voting machines and an increase in disability and sight impaired people as well. So I think it's going from strength to strength in both Australia and in India.
It's a wonderful answer. I just want to add my 2 bits to that. Absolutely, I think 2019 has been a watershed year in a sense for Indian democracy. With Australia, our ties are only strengthening, and I think democratic values lie at the very core of this deepening relationship. I would like to ask a question as a historian that rather than asking what democracy is, we should ask what democracy does. What does democracy do at the moment? And I think Prime Minister Modi has consistently shown that democracy is what it does, whether it is by rolling out a program that frees women in rural and semi-rural households from the tyranny of smoke fire from the chulas, from the indoor stoves, one of the biggest causes of lung cancer, by his LPG scheme, and removing all those wood fire operated stoves, or by now bringing this entire mission of providing tapped water to every Indian, or by pushing forth, led by Minister Piyush Goyal, this program to provide electricity. How fundamental these things are. Democracy is what democracy does, and I think each program of Prime Minister Modi has showcased ideas of democracy actually doing things to make lives better for people. And it is no surprise then that the Honorable Prime Minister now talks about ease of living and not just ease of doing business. Right? And I think India will spend more than $1 trillion in infrastructure. And I would argue that every dollar of that or every rupees of that spent would add into the vibrance and the pluralism of Indian democracy. And I think Australia is such an important partner, especially in some of the topics that Tanya alluded to. Climate change. The Honorable Prime Minister is taking a lead in India in climate change, and Australia is a vital partner in this journey towards strengthening our roots of fighting climate change more effectively. Sustainable development, again, Australia's own history of its attention towards indigenous peoples, and India's own history of doing the same here, formulates another bridge, a living bridge, if I may say so, between these two great nations. And I think in every aspect, as I mentioned, 2019 has been a watershed year, but in India we always believe every watershed year only deserves another one the next year, which will be even better. And it is my determined hope that 2020 will be better.
That was a wonderful answer, and I absolutely agree with you. Democracy is what democracy does, but there are obviously various challenges that democracies encounter, and I'm sure that's the case with both Australia and India. There are definitely some challenges. Would you like to speak on some challenges that democracies encounter?
Sure. So I think, as we've stated, both Australia and India have vibrant democracies and a wonderful dialogue that's being explored through Election Watch and other avenues as well. Having said that, democracy does have its challenges, and I think Winston Churchill is often quoted about saying, democracy is more or less, to paraphrase him, the best system we've got. I think I've said that far more positively than he said it, but I think that's the sentiment. It is the best system we've got. And democracies by nature are diverse and different. They need to be. The importance of a democracy is that it governs the people, it's for the people, by the people, and citizens and societies are different in different places, and democracies reflect that. To take Hindol's point about what does a democracy do, this is also what I think is fundamental when we think about the role of democracies and some of its challenges. So, in my view, we focus very much on the participation in democracy, which is key, and in my view it's necessary but not sufficient. Some of the challenges I think we're seeing around the world, not just limited to our two countries we're discussing today, is that participation increases in democracy, but the beneficiaries of democracy aren't as large. So I think Hindol's point about India's focus on bringing water to all citizens of India, 24/7 electricity to all citizens of India. I think focusing on the beneficiaries of democracy and what governments must do is a really key component on keeping democracies strong. It came up in the Radina dialogue actually when an American was speaking. He spoke of what small states struggling to achieve democracy need to do in order to keep democracy in their small or fragile states. And interestingly, the issue wasn't more finance, it was actually strong examples of where democracy supports people rather than fails people. That's the biggest way in which you can strengthen democracy in fragile states. So I think increasing beneficiaries is key, and I think a necessary component of that is education. So I know that the draft national education policy in India, there's been much discussion and anticipation about this draft national education policy. It is truly going to transform India's focus. I think India now has 70% literacy rates in this country, and literacy will be a very strong component of the education policy. It's also looking at extending the age of Indians from 3 years old to 18. So this again really allows for language and literacy, liberal arts and humanities to be a really strong component. Another aspect of the policy is on ethical leadership and understanding our countries better. So again, to turn to Hindol's point about climate, climate is also something contemplated to be in both the primary school teaching in India as well as the university level as well. And I think these commitments to education and to ethical leadership and to a true appreciation of connection to planet will also help us participate more effectively in democracies and have democracies provide for us. That's a key point. A small one I would like to mention alongside is that a country like India is massive. And so one thing that the Modi government has been very focused on is competitive federalism through the use of structures like Niti Aayog. And the idea there is to bring a more informed governance at a local level, including state level, and allow people to demand more of their democracies through using transparency, data and figures. So this ease of living that Hindol mentioned is in part informed by and strengthened by the work of Niti Aayog, who provides figures on health, on education and other statistics on a state-by-state level, so that states can really transparently see how their policies can be strengthened to really respond to citizen needs and to ensure a wider beneficiary base for democracy.
There's a couple of wonderful points that Tanya has made. I want to take them one by one, just add briefly to them. I do believe that one of the challenges of post-colonial nations like India is that its territorial sovereignty and integrity are still work in progress. It's sort of, being put together even as we speak, and there have been some, as students of social sciences, we would say there have been some challenges at the margins, so to speak, right? And I think those, and the Honorable Prime Minister Modi, has been extremely proactive in putting together a system, a policy framework, which enables India to put that in the past and move forward. Because unless you put your sovereignty issues in place, you cannot effectively move forward as a nation. And I think that has been a great force of good, and we are seeing that being rolled out, and hopefully in the future too. The other great area which I think is of great interest is Prime Minister Modi's reaching out to the world. And I think one of the things that democracies must do is not only what they do at home, but what do they do in the world. And India's increasing role, not only to take a theme that resonated so powerfully in what Tanya said, its role in providing leadership to climate conversations, whether it's at the Paris Agreement or anywhere else in the world, to focus on all the things that India is doing in pushing renewable energy, including solar power. I think in each of these contexts, India is showing not only what it can do at home, but also what it can do in the world. And I think that's really important to remember when we talk about democracy, right? It's not just the domestic, but the international. Indeed, I would go as far as to say that the domestic is international and the international is domestic. The line between them are often blurred. My last point that I want to make in this context is really the idea that India takes its democracy not in one voice, but in multiple voices, right? We take our pluralism seriously. We treasure our pluralism, we are committed to our pluralism, and we see this pluralism pan out in a sort of very Indian celebration. In my days in Oxford, we used to talk about how Sark, for instance, is a bit like a grand Indian shadi, It's this celebration in a sense where there are many partners, and the partners may have some disputes also among one another, but it is still this, broad sort of celebration where not only what is being discussed, but even the processes are important signifiers of democracy. The fact that people arrive, the fact that people get an opportunity to even interact, whether they agree or disagree, the processes are important. Democracy is strengthened by processes, not just by results. Right? And I think that's an important thing to remember. My last point, since Invest India has been mentioned, I think one of Prime Minister Modi's great efforts has been to showcase. People talk about foreign direct investment only as something that sort of, boosts stock markets and so on and so forth. But Prime Minister Modi has consistently propelled the idea that foreign direct investment can do good at the grassroots level. And we are seeing this with the role of foreign direct investment in many aspects of Indian life, where the money that is coming in actually is reaching the grassroots, is transforming lives of the grassroots. So I think all these aspects put together really give us a far more nuanced understanding of the future of Indian democracy.
You mentioned that the one of the key things about Indian democracy is that people interact, and of course they have varied opinions. And I think we cannot discuss, we cannot have a conversation on people's opinions and interactions if we don't discuss social media and how it's impacting everyone's life. And it would be very nice if you could tell us how social media is changing how democracies work in terms of helping people voice out more, or say trolling. What would you like to say on this?
So I think that's a really nice segue actually from Hindol's point that democracies are international in context, and I think social media has really helped to internationalize domestic discussion, and in a way it's a lot more inclusive and transparent. We're now seeing leaders of all countries really participating in social media as well, with some leaders a bit more Twitter active than others, but there's certainly a lot of transparency now. I think social media has had its various impacts, both positive and negative, and I think there are national inquiries into the role of social media and misinformation, and that has an impact on democracy that certainly needs to be explored. But I think there are also a lot of positives as well, and the positives would be Hindol's spoken about climate. I think social media has been a great forum for communicating both ways, not just government to people about what they're doing, but citizens to government, to almost in real time be able to give informed responses to policy ideas and policy developments, and kind of demand of their government outside of the electoral cycle what they want and need from government. So I think that kind of two-way interaction really allows for a more vibrant democracy in some ways. As I said, I think there have been positive uses of it, and I think there have been less positive uses, and we need to take caution quite seriously as well. But certainly the idea to have immediate responses, to be able to respond to things like climate change in a social media setting. What this also does in a way is informally increase the citizenry participation in a democracy. Because in Australia, for example, you need to be at a minimum age of 18 to vote, but you don't need a minimum age to participate on social media. So in some sense, citizens that are under the age of 18 can participate in a vibrant democratic country, even if they can't yet access the process. And I think that's also an interesting opportunity for government as well, to get a bit of a litmus test or an early reading about what our future generations are thinking and our future leaders. I think that's a really exciting opportunity that deserves more exploration.
And I want to take off from that point and really begin by mentioning something so utterly heartwarming, which is that, this is so apparent to everybody who's ever been on social media, even 10 or 15 years ago, without social media, would so many Indians, as the Honourable Australian Ambassador to India mentioned the other day at the Australia-India Youth Dialogue dinner, would so many Indians get an opportunity to emphasize their solidarity with anybody who's been affected by the bushfires in Australia. This overwhelming ground-up support, love, affection, which poured out really in India when this moment happened, tragedy happened, is a really wonderful moment, triggered by, supported by, by social media. And I think it was a wonderful moment for millions of Indians who deeply care about our, brothers and sisters in Australia, where we saw that video, which now has been seen by millions of people, of the rains fall in Australia. I don't think anybody missed that video, and many people, including me, had tears in our eyes when we finally saw that video. This bringing together of people, and it gives me goosebumps even now, but this bringing together of people, there are indeed some not so positive sides of social media, but it is our job as communicators to talk about these wonderful positives. I don't think without the power of social media, this empathy, this love, this affection would transcend borders so easily. And that's a really powerful thing. That a rainfall on Australian soil can move an Indian to tears. I think that is something to truly celebrate. And I think that is the spirit in which the democratic virtues of social media must be used. And it is our job as communicators to re-emphasize at every given opportunity that it can be such a powerful good if we choose to make it a powerful good. And I think I will leave my comments at that, but I think, truly I was overwhelmed by that moment, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to mention that.
Of course, I mean, I totally agree with you. It does bring people together. Especially with the bushfire that happened, the pictures, I think all of us, we discussed and we were moved by it. And also there's a lot that we can learn from it, and I think that's very important. Learnings happen when people interact and people meet. I think Australia-India relationship has been very strong, and there's a lot that we can learn from each other. So probably maybe one thing that Australia could learn from India, or India could learn from India, or India could learn from Australia in terms of how democracy has been functioning in both these countries. Do you want to share something?
I mean, first of all, I just want to really thank Hindol for his beautiful words, and honestly, I was in tears about the Australian bushfires, and it's been devastating, and there's been a lot of devastating loss, and the outpour of affection and love and support and kindness from India has been incredible. Our Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, came to the Rasina Dialogue and also says she had received many positive wishes and sentiments and support. And the Prime Minister's message from Australia also was shown at Rasina Dialogue and thanked India as well. So I really appreciate you saying that. In terms of what we can learn from each other, so as I said before in my comments, and I feel them very deeply, there are many similarities between Australia and India and also many differences, and I think both should be celebrated. The role of a democracy is to govern for its people, so I think the strength in a democracy is to respond to its own citizenry and really take its steer from that. We've had some really wonderful discussions, including an election watch last year, and we hope to do more on elections and speak together about the processes in democracy and how we can make democracies, stronger and more vibrant. And these discussions aren't really to teach one another anything, but to share. And I think it's important that we keep the conversation about sharing what works for us and listening and hearing a little bit more. India, for example, is a first mover in using electronic voting machines. And that's something that, India says works for it. Of a country, as I said, of about 1.3 billion people, 908.7 million of whom are enrolled to vote. Having mechanisms that support this vast, inclusive democracy is really important, and that's not something Australia has in its system. We have about 24 million people, so we're in a very different situation there. So I think the strength of democracy, is to go to Hindol's international point as well, is about keeping those conversations open and having discussions that celebrate sharing and thinking about how we can be more responsive to widen the net of beneficiaries of democracy, as I said before. So I think being really responsive to needs and playing a strong leadership role to look towards sustainable futures. So I think that's where democracies can also work together. So we have democracies that are premised upon providing support and leadership to nations and citizens. But as Hindol mentioned, that internationalisation is key. I think Hindol mentioned SAARC, but there's the East Asia Summit, there's G20, there are a number of regional and global architecture in which Australia and India both are. The World Trade Organization, India's been really active in supporting multilateralism, and I think it's about these rules and processes that allow us to engage so positively on an international stage for international leadership to support sustainable interactivity, growth, prosperity and well-being, and this is key.
I don't have anything really to add to, Tanya's really covered all the aspects. I want to make one small intervention though, which is that what should India and Australia learn from one another, especially on social media, that no matter who wins or loses in cricket, it is okay. I think if we learn that, it would be a wonderful thing. Maybe keep playing a lot more cricket and may the best country team win, and maybe all celebrate together. I think that is something truly worth learning.
So perfect note, sir. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.